Dairy specialist at ADM Nutrition. Candace grew up on a dairy farm near Walkerton, Ontario, then studied at the University of Guelph, graduating first with a Bachelor of Science degree in Animal Science, followed by a Master of Science degree in Dairy Nutrition in 2012. She's worked in the dairy industry since graduation, first as a dairy nutritionist, and for over 3 years in her current role as a dairy specialist for ADM Animal Nutrition. Candace has a specific interest in ADM's model for dairy. The model works with farmers on a whole farm approach to identify opportunities for increased profitability. Candace currently lives in Park Hill with her husband and children. Please welcome Candace to the stage.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak today, and thank you all for being here, and a hello to those on live stream as well. So I have a little outline for the talk today. So first of all, I'm going to offer you a little bit of my perspective. So as mentioned in the introduction, kind of why do I feel like I can talk about this topic? Then I'm going to talk about some of the management factors that I feel impact profitability on farm. And so there's tons, right? But in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on a few. So number one, managing dry matters and dry matter intakes, reducing risk of compromised rumen health, and then planning how to use the forages that you have in-house or maybe don't have in-house, planning how to use forages for the year. So number one, my perspective. So as mentioned in the introduction, so I work for ADM Animal Nutrition, and in that role, we have this model of whole farm profitability. And one of the things that we do in that role, shall I say, or within that model, is a full farm financial analysis. And we call that our ADM profit analysis. So in the process of doing these analyses on farm, we've discovered that the percentage of gross milk revenue that is used to feed the lactating and the dry cows ranges. There's a range that we've identified. It's over 10% difference between the farms that we've analyzed so far. And so what I feel from this information is that there's opportunity. There's opportunity. What is the difference? Why can't one farm be on the spending lower amount of the gross milk revenue on feeding the lactating and dry versus some of the other farms? So the values that we found is the range of 25% of gross milk revenue all the way up to 35% of gross milk revenue being used to feed our lactating and dry cows. So that's the 10% that I'm going to reference throughout the presentation, and there's some outliers on either end, but we're going to use 10% for the purpose of the discussion. So what are some of the things that I observe across these different farms that make me feel that there's opportunity to improve? So number one, monitoring dry matters and dry matter intakes regularly. That most likely means that the farmers, you guys, have to be the ones to do it. I mean, lots of nutritionists are great and they're out there all the time, but it really does need to be done often, and that can often be somewhere where you guys can help out. So it's pretty obvious, but when we change the dry matter of the forage, or if we change how accurate we are when we're loading our TMR, it's changing the whole composition of the TMR. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So it costs you money, and it increases risks of rumen health concerns. So those are points I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. Another point is, has that TMR mixer been calibrated? So it's kind of, again, an obvious point, but if it hasn't been calibrated, then we can have some inaccuracies we may not even know about. Final point on this kind of slide here is that high levels of refusals cost money. Kind of, again, we might know that, but we might use the concept or maybe excuse that, well, I'm feeding it to my heifers, so it's okay, and I'm going to address that. So changes in dry matter of forages cost you money. And so I have a little kind of mini example here. So it's a scenario for the purpose of our discussion with this 80 cow herd, 100 kilograms of quota, and I'm making an estimation of gross milk revenue. I understand that varies based on our our components and whatnot, but just for the purpose of discussion, we're going to say $670,000 of gross milk revenue. So when our forage is wetter, we have less actual forage, less dry matter of forage in that TMR. So there's less percentage of forage in that TMR, and there's less dry matter total in that TMR, assuming that everything else has been added correctly. So I'm identifying that as a cost because it's, in a sense, an opportunity. So if the cows are not able to consume as much as maybe they would like to, there's opportunity. They might have some empty bunk syndrome. They may run out of feed a little earlier. And also, another way to look at cost would be to say if there's vulnerable cows. So when I'm talking about vulnerable cows, let's think about a fresh cow that's come into the pen, and she is eating this diet that's got less forage in it than what we think. And so it could be, depending on how our ration is balanced, it could be kind of putting her on the edge or putting her in a risk situation. So if we have a cow that gets, say, subclinical or even clinical acidosis, there's risk and cost associated with that as well. If the forages are drier, then we have more forage. Kind of obvious, we have more in there than what we thought or what our recipe calls for. So a higher percentage of forage and potentially more refusals. So this I'm identifying as a cost. And I put a very small, simple calculation. I don't have time to go through the whole kind of thing with you today. But just if we look at the example here, so on corn silage and on haylage, if there's 2% or 4 or 6 percentage points drier than what we thought, and that's consistent for the year, then accumulating for the entire year on this 80 cow herd, then the cost is those values in the kind of white column. And when you take those costs as a percentage of gross milk revenue, those are the values in the yellow column. So when we're talking about this range, this 10% range difference of gross milk revenue used to feed our cows, we could identify a fraction of a percentage all the way up to multiple percentage points just from this point alone. Okay, so briefly mention empty bunk syndrome. This one. I hope I never see this ever again and never have the opportunity to take a picture of it. So empty bunk, why is that a concern? So when we have an empty bunk, what happens is that when cows are then offered feed kind of in a free choice situation, right? Most of the times it's in a pen situation. So when we do feed, it's offered what we'll call ad libitum or free choice. They'll eat a lot, and we call that slug feeding. They just gorge. And so what happens then is that we predispose those cows to either subclinical or clinical acidosis. So why do we care about acidosis? Well, here's a fancy picture. So the picture or the image is the rumen papillae. So the rumen papillae are the finger-like projections that line the rumen, and they're absolutely essential for the absorption of nutrients. So in the control, it's a papillae that's in a very happy environment. It's looking really pretty. On the right-hand side, the acidosis scenario, so that's a rumen that's in a state of acidosis. There's a lot of disintegrity of those cells. An inflammatory response occurs. The epithelial barrier function is compromised. You can see all that kind of sloughing and lack of integrity of the cells. And it impacts the ability of the rumen to absorb nutrients. So again, if we're talking about cows that absolutely need to absorb a lot of nutrients and they can't even do it, we're having a double kind of whammy. Okay, so high levels of refusals cost money even if you're feeding it to heifers, but we'll just talk about how much it costs to have the high level of refusals to begin with. So I've made some assumptions. I'm leaving it on the same kind of concept of these 80 cows and 100 kilograms of quota. But let's just say for a moment that you currently have 7% of refusals, and you've made a decision that you don't want to spend this money having these waste, let's pretend it's being put in the pen or compost or whatever. So you're making a decision to bring it down to 3%. Number one, if you're going to do that, you do really have to manage the bunk well. Having higher refusals is almost like insurance. So first of all, we have to make sure that we're managing it well. So we never have an empty bunk scenario or a system where a situation where the cows can't reach the feed, even if there is feed there. So let's assume that we're decreasing it. What does that represent? So again, in this scenario, it represents over $8,000 or 1% of gross milk revenue. So again, referring back to that 10% gap, we found another possible percentage point. Now again, don't have time to do all the equations with you today in this moment, but if we were to feed those extra refusals to the heifers, again, assuming this herd size and the amount of feed that would be left, so that 4% difference from that 3 to 7% of refusals, if we feed those to the heifers and just feed them a little bit less heifer TMR, that's still costing a 0.5 percentage point. And so still identifying some more of that opportunity. Okay, so rumen health. I guess I have a little bit of a particular interest in rumen health, so we'll talk about this. So reducing sorting, some of the risks that can lead to compromised rumen health would be sorting, so we want to reduce that risk. We want to reduce the risk of insufficient fiber being consumed and reduce heating of the TMR, which of course can impact dry matter intake, which also impacts rumen health, and lots of other things can go on there as well. Excuse me. So reduce sorting. So you can see, I hope, in the picture, hopefully is clear enough, there's lots of long particle, fiber material in this TMR. So chop length, chop length, chop length. Absolutely, if there's lots of long pieces, it gives the cows plenty of opportunity to sort that out. It can create some concerns that they're not actually consuming what we think they're consuming or what we've balanced for them to consume. And just another image of some of the lengths that we end up dealing with and how it's really hard to keep those in the mix when they're so long. It's actually pretty easy for the cows to be sorting those out. Okay, so also with regards to reducing sorting, what other things are we going to look at? So the dry matter of the TMR. Lots of you guys as farmers are really great at managing the dry matter of TMR at delivery. So your nutritionists work with you and they do great jobs, and you guys do as well. So at delivery, we've got this, we'll call it a perfect TMR that's delivered, but what can happen is that the refusals can end up looking completely different than what was laid down. So it could be wetter. So we could have situations where the bunks may be along an outside wall, rain has come in, or sprinklers, depending on how they're set up, how the wind and everything is blowing, and fans. We can have sprinklers actually getting our TMR really wet and kind of get stinky and gross, and cows certainly don't want to eat that. We can also have our feed getting dry. That's actually pretty common, especially when it's sitting out there for, say, a 24-hour period, which is pretty common, right? So over those 24 hours, it can be exposed again to wind or sun, depending on how the fans are positioned. And also, as the cows consume it, there's less feed in the bunk. And so it can, depending again how well it's pushed up, it can kind of create like a thinner layer of feed, which is, there's just a lot more opportunity for it to dry out because there's just much less of it. It's a thin kind of blanket laying out there just waiting to dry out. And then reducing competition at the bunk. So when there's competition, cows can be kind of prone to smaller, more aggressive meals, and kind of back to that concept of slug feeding, just going and grabbing as much as I can in this moment because I might not have a chance to come back to the bunk in a bit, for a while, I mean. So some of the things that can create competition that we might not always think of is when the TMR is not evenly mixed. And so there could be all kinds of different situations why it's not mixed maybe as evenly as what we would hope. So the cows almost do like a grazing thing where they go along the bunk and they try to find, well, which spot along the bunk has the best tasting feed. And so it creates this scenario of a lot of kind of aggressive bunk behavior, which is not something we're wanting. Also, is that feed evenly distributed along the bunk? So we can have situations where maybe there's a high traffic area at one part of the barn and the bunk just gets cleaned completely up right there really quickly. And then that whole rest of the bunk still has tons of feed, but it just means there's a lot less bunk area for the cows to eat. And so we're in a sense increasing our competition because there's simply less inches of feed for the number of cows in the pen. And we're going to talk about push-ups in a minute. So the big picture on the right. Could we agree that this feed needs to be pushed up? Hands, maybe? Okay, so it needs to be pushed up, and for those maybe not quite seeing what I'm seeing, there's lots of what we call little nests or bare areas on the floor where that feed is just had the opportunity to be sorted and could potentially be out of reach from the animals. So what we would like is for that feed to kind of be pushed back up so it doesn't have the opportunity to dry out and the cows can reach it well and it kind of gets mixed again. The concern here is that the automatic feed pusher just went. So this is what I call ineffective push-ups. So we can have feed that gets pushed up very regularly, but not effectively. And that's also a huge concern in my opinion. So watching behavior, the small picture here, I apologize, it might be a little blurry, but the concept, and the cow's actually leaving the bunk when I finally got the picture. But her front leg is extended right into the manger, and what she's trying to do is get a little bit more extension to be able to reach just a little bit further to be able to reach some new feed. I mean, there's tons of feed in the bunk, but she wants that stuff that she can't reach, that's not been touched by somebody else. So looking at behavior, looking at neck injuries, how much hair loss or removal do we have? Talking about the timing of our push-ups, so making sure they're effective, of course, first, but how often do we push up? There is some research that indicates that if we push up every half an hour for the first 2 hours after feeding, we allow subordinate cows the opportunity to eat at the bunk when they're highly motivated. When are they highly motivated? They're highly motivated to eat right after feeding or right after milking, both. So if the feed has been laid, and that's a high motivation to eat, but all the boss cows are there, and I don't want to go and compete, then once they've had the chance to lie down, the feed has still been kept pushed up, it's still mixed nicely, then I have the opportunity to go and eat while I'm still interested. Little comment on labor, labor and fuel versus an automatic pusher. So not related to the cost of feed, but other costs on farm is the man hours and the tractor hours or fuel usage required for manual feed push-ups. So in certain situations, we found a percentage point or two that can be found from gross milk revenue that have been used in a lot of man hours and tractor hours on the feed push-up side. Okay, reducing the risk of insufficient fiber. So this is, I hope everyone is aware of Penn State Shaker Box. I can't say enough about the Penn State Shaker Box. It's one of my favorite tools, and I wish every farmer had one. So if you want to do one thing for Christmas, for me, buy yourself a Penn State Shaker Box and use it often. It can tell such an important story. So in this case, it's pretty obvious based on the numbers that I'm providing. This, on the left-hand side is the fresh lactating TMR, and it's, the numbers are close to what we would say for our goal or our recommendation. However, the refusals, 24 hours later, are vastly different and very problematic. So there's a lot of fiber that has not been consumed by the cows that's been left in the top pan, and correspondingly, a lot less of the fines. So the cows have done an excellent job consuming those fines and leaving those long particles. So that is a huge concern. The cow wasn't consuming all the fiber that we balanced for and that we thought she was going to consume. The other part of this is that when we do these shaker boxes, sometimes we just do it once, we set ourselves up and we think, we're good for the next while. But there are things that can change how forages, like what the forages look like, and therefore how the TMR comes out. So just think about the processing of the forages. When we put it in the bunk or we put it in the silo, the processing that occurs for it to be packed or to be put in the blower, there is processing that occurs at that point. Then, when we remove it, we either have a silo unloader or a defacer or different equipment that we're using to remove that forage that also processes it. Then we put it in the TMR mixer. Well, depending how many knives we have in there and how sharp they are and how long we mix it for, we can certainly create a scenario where we don't have enough physically effective fiber. And depending on how much chemical fiber we have in that ration can depend on how risky of a situation that is. We can also run into situations where the feed freezes and it becomes, the structure becomes a little more brittle. And so we might think that we're doing okay, but that 1 day or 2 days or whatever in the winter, it actually just pulverizes. It just pulverizes. We also, there's lots of concepts out there, I need lots of long fiber for my cows. Yes, you do need physically effective fiber for your cows, but if it's in excess of their requirements, all it does is make it take longer to eat. So you actually can be making it a bit of like a problem almost for those cows. Okay, so reducing the heating of the TMR, absolutely, absolutely, you have to start with the forages. If those forages aren't fermented properly, don't even, that's the number one point to start at. So if there's poor fermentation or they're not fermented, you're feeding fresh forages or partially fermented forages, your risks are high right from the get-go. And sorry, I'll do this second. So that's the forages first being our primary fermentation, wanting that to be appropriate, and then secondary fermentation we have to watch out for. So secondary fermentation is the fermentation that occurs when we're feeding out. So as soon as that feed gets exposed to oxygen, there's a lot of risks, and you can see the yeasts and molds and stuff and heating that can occur. So I've made a small list of some of the areas where I see risk, things that can increase our risk of heating of the TMR. And just to make a little reference of the picture at the bottom, when we, it's okay, thank you. When we have the bunk where we've got this feed that we pulled down and we didn't actually use it all on day one, then it just sits there. It's been exposed to oxygen and it can heat. And so again, that's secondary fermentation that's occurring, that then if we put it in the TMR, we're just asking for problems. Yeah, okay. I think I covered pretty much all of that. Okay, so planning how to use forages for the year. I'm going to talk about inventory and avoiding multiple forage changes and feeding fresh forage. So I'm not actually going to have a specific slide dedicated to this point, just again in the interest of time. I feel it's a little bit self-explanatory, but just to maybe emphasize that point for a moment here, some of the variation that I've seen in cow performance and in components has been really extreme in situations when we have excessive forage changes and when we're feeding fresh forages. So understand that's a risk. Finally, consider the efficiency of filling your TMR. Okay, so inventory. Do inventory assessments. If tap into all the people on your team that you can to do them, and to do them regularly. Update them. Make sure that after a few weeks, months, etc., that you're still on track. So not enough forage is a risk and a cost in a sense. We have to plan early. We don't want to be all of a sudden in the summer being like, oh shoot, don't have forage source, what am I going to do? I'm going to buy this extender, maybe I'm buying a wet commodity, and now it's a huge risk because it's hot and it molds, and it just becomes a risky and a difficult situation. When we have too much forage, it's also risk because it's a lot of cost. You had to pay to put it in, and then there's risk during the storage process of losses, and that's what the bottom picture is about. So we could have rodents or animals or tractors or whatever that could destroy our feed, and then we have losses. Have a backup plan for when we have poor quality or poor yield. So that's a part of reality, and certain parts of the province are more at risk for this than others. Be creative in sourcing your feed for your cows and talk to your nutritionist. There's lots of ways we can balance rations for cows. And we don't want to end up feeding anything really ugly like that, even to the heifers. Okay, so the efficiency of filling your TMR, consider the route. How many different places across the yard are you actually having to drive to fill this thing? It could take a lot of man hours, a lot of tractor hours. Maybe you have multiple tractors running across the yard and they're all having to be turned on and started up every day. It can be quite an inefficient system. How many systems do you have to fill the TMR? So do you have an egg bag and a bunker silo and a tower silo and a shipping container and a baleage? It can get very complicated and very inefficient. How long does it take you to fill that TMR? And chopping baleage, I kind of put a special note here because it does take time to chop baleage in a TMR mixer. And certainly that can be a part of our fuel usage as well. Also have to be really careful when we're doing a baleage and corn silage blend that we're not pulverizing our corn silage in the process, because then we create risk of rumen health issues. So lots of combination between all these points. And plan well. So, you know, sometimes our herds grow over time and all of a sudden, wow, we don't have enough feed storage. We need to kind of make some plan for building it on, or maybe we're being proactive and we want to grow, so we need to be strategic. Invite knowledgeable people to offer their opinion. It's really interesting when you have multiple heads working on the same project, how many bottlenecks you can address before they become a reality for you. So my conclusion here is that there's opportunity to increase your margin, to change how much of gross milk revenue is being used to feed your lactating and dry cows, and it all comes down to reducing risk. So I hope that you know, we've only addressed some of the management factors that lead to this opportunity that I've identified. But anyway, hope I've shared some interesting thoughts with you today. And with that, if there's time, I'll take a question or two.
I got one. Okay. Well, not me. Folks up in Earlton, Candace, are wondering if you can elaborate or explain what makes an ineffective push-up of feed.
Of course. So the image that I showed was where the feed, there was still lots of nests. I don't know if I can go back to the, it might take to this one. So where we still have lots of kind of bare spaces, so that feed has not been properly mixed or pushed up. So some of it actually the cows still can't reach. So the feed pusher is gone, you know, you think the job's done, but it's not been done effectively. And this image is exactly what I'm talking about.
Cool. So anyways, the folks up in Timmins are wondering, up in their neck of the woods, what would the cutoff date be for cutting hay in Timmins?
You're asking the wrong person.
No, you're the right person. What's the answer?
Talk to your agronomist. Really, the point that I'm addressing is making sure that you have enough and that you don't have too much. So what do I mean by enough? I mean by, you know, if we can always feed fermented forage, that's important to me. If we don't have enough, don't stress your crops. I mean, be creative in sourcing it. There are opportunities to source, you know, from out west or different places, or using different fiber sources in your ration. Be creative and talk to your nutritionist.
Thank you. Another question from the folks up in Earlton. Are there any pros or pro and con suggestions for adding water to TMR?
Yes. Yes, so certainly we do understand there's increased risk in the summer, that it can kind of increase the risk of heating, and it's a bit of a balancing act between that and sorting. So certainly adding water can very, very, very much help reduce sorting. Didn't exactly reference that in the presentation, but very glad it was brought up as a question, because absolutely, absolutely, highly, highly recommend to add water and enough water. And make sure your forages aren't predisposed to heating so that you can still use a bit in the summer. And you may have to use some mold and yeast inhibitors, and I think Terry Noon would be thrilled to chat with you guys about that.
Boy, these online folks are hogging all the questions here, but I got a couple more. So up in Werner, so for the gross milk revenue percentage, are you using whole ration costs?
Yeah, so to offer a bit of clarity, it's the total cost, so it's all the forage and all the grain, meaning all the homegrown and all the purchased, regardless of how those percentages are balanced out. So that's on a full farm financial analysis. Was that the exact question? Did I answer it?
Are you using whole ration costs?
Yeah, so
on the
yes.
gross milk revenue percentage?
Yes, and we have to find those costs through the analysis, because a lot of folks are not aware of what their forage costs are. So we calculate it for each farm in the process of the analysis, and then we use your actual forage costs for these analysis. So certainly if you have a high forage cost versus a low forage cost, that impacts. Also, if you have a low revenue versus a high revenue, that impacts how much of your percentage is going to be used to feed your cows.
And Werner confirms that is exactly what they wanted to know. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
So I understand that of course we want to feed perfect haylage and everything else, and you get your picture, your corn silage bag with some rips in it. Is any mold too much mold, or what kind of tolerance are we allowed here? Because things don't always go perfect.
Wonderful question. In my opinion, it's all about managing risk. So we all are going to have years and bunks and scenarios where we have feed that's not as ideal. So trying to feed that to cows that are less critical or fragile, so not feeding it to your close-up dry cows, not feeding it to your fresh cows, those kind of concepts. So wherever we can reduce risk, reduce risk. Whatever we can do to make sure that feed goes in properly inoculated and all those kinds of things, we do the best we can, and we live with reality, right? Life is just fun, right?
Candace, folks out in Sussex, New Brunswick, so welcome to you folks out there. Would like you to head over to your Penn State shaker box slide, if you may. Oh, is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. And so what they're wondering, was it a dry matter issue or a long fiber issue, chop length, top box specifically? Does that make sense?
Yeah, all of the above. So the chop length was excessively long, the material was dry, so the dry matter of the TMR was not appropriate, and it was fed over a 24-hour period, so there was plenty of time for the cows to do lots of sorting. You know, if we would have fed this exact ration, say, twice a day, we may have had a scenario where there was less opportunity to sort, and then again, that push-up schedule will impact how aggressively they're able to sort as well.
Thank
I
you.
think we have time for one more question, if there is one more question. Nothing online? Nothing else?
Oh, the far side.
Oh, you gotta stick your hand up high so I can see you.
Maybe address this point. How much milk are you losing by going to, say, 4% refusal versus feeding 7-8% refusal? And is that factored into your costs?
Yeah, so how much milk are you going to lose if you have a low refusals versus a high refusals is essentially the question, I believe. Have I addressed that appropriately? So my answer is it depends. It depends on how well that bunk is managed and if there's ever a time when those cows don't have feed. So if there's ever what we would call an empty bunk syndrome where there's still maybe feed there but it's out of reach, or what is there has kind of been sorted out, those are risk situations in my opinion. So those would be things that could lead to less milk production. So I don't have an exact number for you, but I certainly acknowledge your point that if you're going to go to a low refusals, you have to be ready to manage that bunk extremely, extremely well. Does that answer your question? Because you don't want to lose milk production in that process, and that will come out in our analysis if you do. So for instance, if you lost milk, you're going to have less gross milk revenue, right? So then the percentage that it takes to feed your cows is going to be a greater percentage, if all else has stayed equal.
Thank you, Candace. We appreciate that information. Last year at this meeting, we had a lot of talks about toxins and wild yeast, so a lot of that is very relevant information continuing how